series. My name is David Hart, and I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. I'd now like to introduce today's speaker, Josh Stoll, and I'm going to do so by just two words that I want to reflect on for a sec, and the two words are brain drain. You hear about this, right? That young people leave Maine, they go away, they get an education, they get jobs in some other place, and they're lost from Maine, and we're poor off because of it. And that might look like it was where Josh was headed. He grew up in down East Maine. He went to school at Bates for his undergraduate degree, and then he headed away to Duke University down in North Carolina. After a while, he found his way back to Maine, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Along the way, Josh gained a lot of experience with fishing and fishing boats. He fishing for lobster, shrimp, flounder. He's operated his own oyster farm since 2014. I recently heard him give a talk about a completely different facet of his work, resilience in lobster fishing communities. And there's a great story about that on the Mitchell Center's website, Navigating Change, Cultivating Resilience in Fisheries and Coastal Communities. This a story written by Liz Solette, our communications coordinator. But whether he's giving that talk, which was really wonderful, or the one today, what you will quickly see is that he is deeply committed to the well-being of coastal communities, especially in rural areas, especially in Maine. And so I think it's kind of nice when people go away and learn about the rest of the world. But if they come back, we are very fortunate. And so I think this is certainly a case to be celebrated of a brain gain rather than a brain drain. So today, Josh is going to be talking about his work on local and regional seafood systems with the clever title of Fishy Tale About Our Food System. Take it away, Josh.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate that introduction. I hope everyone is doing well in this lovely spring afternoon. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that the University of Maine is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation. And as a member of the University of Maine faculty, I fully recognize that the tribe is a sovereign people and has the power to self-govern. I would also like to quickly make a comment about being the last speaker in the Mitchell Center for Sustainability talks seminar series. We often think about saving the best for last, but I feel like after looking at so many fantastic talks this semester, it's an important disclaimer to say that won't be the case for this talk. But if it's any consolation, I'm really excited to be here and excited to share this work that I've been doing with coastal communities around the country for the last 10 years. And so the title of my talk is A Fishy Tale About Our Food Systems. And I feel like it's important to start with a definition of fishy. And it can be defined two ways according to the internet. Number one, fishy is of, like, or full of fish, or dubious, open to suspicion, and unsafe. So in other words, fishy is fish, or it's something unsavory and dubious. If anyone has been watching Netflix recently, you will certainly know that there's a lot of talk about these dubious and suspicious and unsafe practices happening in fisheries. My talk is not about that, and it's a more optimistic perspective on fishing and fisheries. But I want to start by thinking about the different ways that we can think about the fishiness of fisheries. And I'm going to lay out four different ways. The first three are not what my talk is about, and the last one is what my talk is about. So very briefly, four different ways that we can think about fisheries being fishy. The first one is around fishy labeling, right? So Much of the seafood that is out in the seafood system, as you've probably heard, is mislabeled. And so there's been quite a bit of work done on this, looking at how different types of fisheries are mislabeled. And so in some cases, you think you're buying one thing and it turns out it's something else. And research has shown that in some cases, certain species are pretty extensively mislabeled, while other species are not. So when we think about fisheries, there's this issue of fishy labeling, if you will. There's also a lot of talk about fishy fishing. In other words, illegal and unreported fishing activities. And again, there has been extensive work on this, looking at the percentage of fisheries that are caught illegally or aren't reported, which has all kinds of implications for sustainability. Another fishy activities, fishy practices. And so this has also been a topic that has made news quite extensively. And this is around issues of human rights abuses and slavery in fisheries. And so there's a lot of different ways we think sort of negatively about fishing and fishing practices. My interest is while these are all important topics, my own interest is on something different. And I'm particularly interested in this idea of fishy food systems and its consequences for coastal and rural communities and the implications they have for sustainability. So this is work by Cottrell et al. That shows that in our food systems, whether you're talking about agriculture or livestock, fisheries or aquaculture, we are seeing increased prevalence of shocks in these systems. It's not just the increased prevalence of them, but it's also the magnitude of those shocks. And so this is a topic that is of particular interest to me and is the focus of my presentation today. So what is causing these shocks in food systems and what are the implications? So I'd like to focus on three questions for this presentation. The first is, why does the fishiness of our food systems, and in this case in particular, of seafood systems matter? Second, what makes our seafood systems quote unquote fishy? And then third, how are coastal communities working towards solutions? And I think this last piece is really important. This talk is, I'm giving this as part of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. This is not just about problems, this is about solutions. So we'll be talking a lot about the work that we're doing to think and drive solutions forward to support sustainable seafood systems. So I want to start with this question of why does it matter? Why do we care about the fishiness of our seafood systems? And I want to offer three sort of points. The first one is around poverty. So this is data showing world food commodity prices from 1971 to 2017. And here in, you can see in 2006, 2007, you see this spike. And this happens around the Great Recession, the global financial crisis that happened. This is a global shock that impacts the price of food. And global studies have suggested that this alone drove something like 80 million people into poverty. So the increase, this global shock has this negative impact on price that drives people into poverty. So part of the reason that this is important is it has to do with poverty. It also has to do with food insecurity. This is some data that I pulled from the US Census Bureau Household Pulse Survey, which they have been conducted, which the US Census Bureau has been conducting on a weekly basis since April of 2020 of households in the United States. And this is poverty data, this is food insecurity data, I'm sorry. And in April of 2020, a little bit less than 10% of adults reported being food insecure. As of last week, last month, more than 12% of adults in the country reported being food insecure. So this is during the COVID-19 pandemic, during this crisis. It has disrupted our food systems, is leading to food insecurity. So poverty is one, food insecurity is a second really important reason why we should care about food systems. And the third, this is data from the National Marine Fisheries Service that's responsible for managing fisheries. They did a national assessment, and revenue for fisheries in the first 6 months of the pandemic was down $126 million. And so this means this has implications for jobs, it has implications for livelihood, it has implications for well-being. So why do we care about food system shocks and the fishiness of our food systems? It comes down to issues of poverty, food insecurity and hunger, and livelihoods and economic well-being. So then the question is, what is driving this instability or these problems, the fishiness in our food systems? Well, there are a lot of different ways that you can think about this. One of them comes back to this number. According to the United Nations, 78% of globally produced seafood is impacted by trade in some way. It's either directly traded globally or the price is impacted by other seafood that is traded. That represents a 515% increase in the last 3 decades. So part of what is driving the fishiness in our food systems is this increased globalization of seafood as a global commodity. So Kumi et al. Break this down in a slightly more nuanced and detailed way. And they do a global assessment looking at the globalization of our food systems, including seafood. And this is a pretty complicated figure. The key thing here is to pay attention to the direction of the arrows and the color of the arrows. If the arrows are going down, it's negative, and the more red they are, the worse the outcome is. Based on production diversity, so that means the diversity of food that is being produced in a given country, the supply diversity, the import independence, and the reliance on trade partners, US scores close to the bottom of all countries. So you can see here, there's a lot of red, there's a lot of downward facing arrows. To summarize this, we are now getting our food from an increased number of places around the world, and we have less production diversity. That means we're producing less variety of different things. We have an increased dependence on imports, and we have fewer import partners. And in a sense, what this does is it sets us up for a suite of vulnerabilities. Should there be some type of global or regional shock, the supply chain is essentially becomes less functional. In addition to this increased dependence on global supply of food, including seafood, one of the challenges that this globalized food system has is it creates, it becomes more difficult to understand the sources of our food. And with that, we set ourselves up for surprise. Some research that we published a couple of years ago, we actually looked at the global distribution of lobster, which is of course near and dear to the state of Maine. And what we found is that lobster has become a global commodity. It is traded worldwide. This is a figure that we put together showing where lobster gets distributed around the world. And if you simply look at trade partners, this is using UN trade data. If you look at the direct countries of export, you get one story. But what was really interesting is many countries then turn around and re-export that product. So you can sort of conceptually, you can think of it, rather than the United States trading it to some kind of export, some kind of international market, there becomes these quote unquote layover stops that lobster makes. And this figure on the right here shows all the different lobster that is being distributed through these layovers. The challenge with this is that in creating this complexity, it also becomes more difficult to understand where product goes, where the final markets are, and if there are some type of disruption in these places, it sets us up for surprise, which is not good when we're thinking about food system resilience. So in addition to the complexity, the lack of diversification in the distribution of food products, we're also becoming more globalized when it comes to inputs into food systems. This is an example of work that colleagues and I have looking at bait distribution for the Maine lobster fishery. So this figure on the left here shows data from 2002 to 2019 and the percentage of herring used in that fishery. So herring is a locally sourced bait. And what you can see here is a pretty clear pattern. Historically, we use mostly local bait, and through time, for various reasons, we are becoming more and more reliant on different and alternative types of bait. And this figure on the right provides a map of different approved sources of bait that are being used to support the Maine lobster fishery. And so the point here is that the food system is not being globalized on the export side and the production side, but it's also the inputs that are required to support these fisheries. And this map shows all the different places where lobster is, bait is being used to support the lobster fishery. So it's one thing to think about the fishiness and the issues embedded in our food systems and the problems. And it's quite easy to point to the issues. And yet there's, I would argue, there's also a need to understand the solutions, understand how do we make our food systems more resilient. And so in order to do that, colleagues and I have been going back in history to understand how different fisheries have responded to shocks. And one of the fisheries that we're doing this is the Maine lobster fishery. And in order to do that, we have been reviewing newspaper articles from the Bangor Daily News since the early 1990s. And we've reviewed over 9,000 articles at this point. And the idea is that if we can go back into these articles, we can understand what were the different adaptation strategies that happened during different crises. And so you can see here, this is the price of lobster through time. And every once in a while, you see some kind of major dip. And those end up correlating back to various types of crises. So if you end up looking at the newspaper articles during these timeframes, we can better understand, well, what were the strategies that helped the lobster fishery or other fisheries recover or rebound from crisis. And so it's quite interesting. When you do this, you find all kinds of interesting things. You find some kind of random articles about people stealing lobster. You see where the Bangor Daily News is, somebody is talking about how wonderful it is that lobster is being promoted on the late night TV show, the QVC TV show. You see so kind of funny things. You also see things about the changing in the ecology and the status of the fishery. You learn things about moments in time when there's problems in the fishery. You learn about changes in catch history. So you can learn a lot from doing these types of reviews. And so one of the things that we've been particularly interested in is thinking about this idea of food system resilience. So this is work by Kendall et al. And they sort of lay out this food system resilience adaptation cycle. It starts with this idea that some kind of shock happened. There's a period of absorbing that shock, reacting, restoring, learning, and rebuilding better. And so by combining these newspaper articles to, or intersecting these newspaper articles to this resilience framework, we can ask this question: how do seafood systems respond and build resilience to shocks? And this is all with this idea of, if we can understand these patterns, maybe there's ways to strengthen and not just study the problems in the food system, but also engage and contribute to the solutions and strengthen the resilience of coastal communities. So this work is focused on, in particular, we've drilled into these three key crises that have happened in the last several decades. One around the World Trade Center attacks, the Great Recession, and more regionally, this ocean heat wave that led to an early molt of lobster and created some conflict with Canada in their processing facilities. And one of the things that's very interesting about this is there are all kinds of different adaptation strategies. And so we've analyzed those adaptation strategies. I'd be happy to get into the details, into the weeds of what those look like, other than to say it's not just one type of response that ends up playing out, but it tends to be sort of a constellation of strategies that are deployed. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds on this, but I want to highlight that in all three of the cases, there's a really strong focus on economic and focus on restoring and strengthening seafood markets. And in particular, in the short term, in each of these cases, we see this pivot from global seafood distribution system, which is kind of the predominant system in our seafood economy. So there's this pivot from global to local and domestic in the short term. And then longer term, there's this reinforcing of the global seafood supply system, the global seafood system in general. So just to step back for a second. So this piece in particular has been quite interesting to me, because over the last 10 years, I've had the privilege of working with and engaging with coastal communities around the country to think about and to help strengthen local and regional seafood systems in Maine and around North America. And in some ways, the pandemic has created this really interesting opportunity to explore this hypothesis that during periods of system shock, we see this multiple times in the past in the lobster fishery, but how does this apply more broadly to other systems and other fisheries? We might expect to see that the seafood system goes from hyper-global towards local. And so in order to test this hypothesis, I want to sort of take I want to come back to this hypothesis, but in order to do that and to explain the research that we're currently doing around that question, I want to take a small detour to talk about some of the applied work that I've been doing with coastal communities. And it starts in North Carolina. David mentioned that I'd worked in North Carolina previously. And I had the privilege of working with a group of fishermen in Eastern North Carolina to do some direct marketing of seafood. And I want to tell that story and then come back to this hypothesis. And in my view, it's important to understand the story to understand this hypothesis. And so this story starts something like this. At a national level in fisheries, the federal government uses something called the Fish Stock Sustainability Index. This is equivalent to the Dow Jones of fisheries. It's what the National Marine Fisheries Service reports to Congress to say, how are we doing with our fisheries through time? And it's a maximum score of 1,000. And as you can see, through time, we've been progressively getting better and better. And we're now at a score of close to 800. Now, that in some ways seems like an important success story, and no ways do I challenge that. But at the level of the community, at the level of coastal communities around the country, the story often looks much different. And I share this picture. This is taken by the photographer Jason Houston in Eastern North Carolina. I share this photo because in some ways it captures a much more accurate depiction of what coastal communities are facing, as opposed to this sort of conglomerate score, fish stock sustainability score that looks like things are in pretty good shape. You have the aging of the working waterfront, the sort of the struggle of the small boat operator, you have the big McMansion in the background. And in many ways, this tells the story of coastal communities, and at least in Eastern North Carolina, in a pretty real way, where this fish stock sustainability index, in some ways, doesn't feel like it's telling this story. So I had the privilege of working with a group of small-scale fishermen in this region who, at the time, and I would say still arguably today, were really struggling to remain viable. And they were operating under this sort of old model of doing business of high volume, low value, and were looking to pivot to this new reality that was focused on low volume, high value. And in order to do that, they launched something called a community supported fishery, very similar to the community supported agriculture model, in which consumers prepaid for a share of seafood and on a weekly basis went and picked it up. The group sort of anticipated through a set of workshops and focus groups that it would be successful, and in some ways were blown out of the water in terms of how successful it ended up being. This became this long-term initiative that became a co-op. I won't spend very much time on this, but this will give you sort of a sense of what it meant on the consumer side to participate in a direct marketing arrangement like this. So on the left here, you see a variety of different seafood species that consumers, or that are caught in North Carolina. People signed up. This is sort of the first season of operations for 12 weeks, and got a variety of different species through the course of the season. Some of the, here over on the left, you see that some of the predominant species were things that consumers were probably already familiar with, things like flounder, shrimp, clams, but they also got to try new species as well. And so things like jumping mullet, sea mullet, and triggerfish were species that over half of the members who participated had actually never tried before. So this provided an opportunity to consumers to try new species. It provided an opportunity for fishermen to connect with consumers. And it also provided an opportunity for harvesters to earn more money for their catch, as opposed to selling it directly through traditional fish houses, through the traditional supply chains. This is just a quick figure showing the price premium that fishermen receive. This is an example of blue crabs. This is over a 2-year period. This is the price, the average price that they would have gotten had they sold through conventional outlets versus the price that they got when they sold through this direct marketing arrangement. And so when you actually add this up, you look at over a 2-year period, fishermen participating in these direct to consumer direct marketing arrangements, we found in this case, fishermen received a 33% price premium, as well as an end of the year profit sharing dividends equal to somewhere between 16 and 18 cents per pound that they contribute to this arrangement. So one of the things that has been exciting to me and important about this work for me is that it's not just about fishermen using this type of business arrangement to make more money, but it's also been about the internal processes and evolution that happens when groups of harvesters come together to work together to make direct connections to their local communities. And so this is a bit of a conceptual diagram that I want to step through really briefly. So in this case, you have a fisherman participating in this community-supported fishery, initially with the goal of making more money. But then two things happen. First, in order to participate in one of these, it requires a level of cooperation to happen internally within the group of harvesters that are doing this work. That requires a set of information gathering and sharing. So people are keeping track of the different transactions that are happening, developing sets of bylaws, articles of incorporation, rules of engagement. So that's all happening internally within a group of harvesters. There's also this interesting thing that happens where this new arrangement requires engagement with consumers themselves. And so rather than just selling to a fish house or selling to the dock and being done with it, suddenly you're engaging with the end consumer. And that requires this new level of communication, this engagement with social media, this ability or this forcing you into talking about the work you're doing at a different level with people who may not be familiar with fishing practices, may have questions, may have concerns, things like that. And through this process, you see this sort of emerging of bonding capital. So that's the benefits derived from relationships within groups of people, as well as bridging capital. And so this is the value you derive from relationships with people outside of your immediate community. In work we've done on this, we talk about that as facilitating adaptability and adaptation. And so it goes from this model of fishermen participating in a seafood marketing arrangement to make money, to fishermen participating in an initiative that facilitates adaptation. And this becomes really important to thinking about resilience and sustainability of coastal communities. And we call this institutional starters. So, how do you take an individual fisherman who's doing their own thing, trying to make a living, trying to survive, to suddenly a group of fishermen working together, not just to make more money, but to address problems in particular communities that are critical to the sustainability of the resources, the fisheries themselves, or critical to the sustainability of the industry itself, and which arguably is both of those things are important for coastal community resilience. And as a case in point, this group eventually it started as an informal relationship, ultimately eventually turned it into a fisherman's co-op. They're still functioning. And as part of this work, they identified that the loss of working waterfront was critical to their long-term sustainability. And they engaged in a process of writing a grant, successfully winning that grant, and then working with an architect, doing regional, national trips to visit different types of working waterfront, and ultimately coming up with this vision for what the future of working waterfront in Eastern North Carolina might be. And so what is interesting about this, and I promise I'm coming back to this hypothesis about how during times of crisis, what happens to the seafood system, and do you see the shift back towards local? So what has been interesting about this work is that this work in North Carolina is one case in Eastern North Carolina, but through that experience, we have this opportunity to learn from and engage with communities all across North America who started reaching out to say, how do we do this in our communities? And it wasn't about how do we get North Carolina seafood in our community? It was how do we rethink about seafood as an integral part of our local and regional food systems, as well as an integral part of local and regional sustainability and resilience. And through that process of engaging with and learning from and connecting with communities, we've ended up forming a network called the Local Catch Network in 2011. That network has continued slowly to evolve and grow and mature. And today, the network has over 200 seafood businesses and community entities that are part of it. They're based across North America that are doing community-based seafood that centers seafood in local and regional contexts and using it as a tool for community development. As part of this work, the network has developed a set of core values, articulating what it's trying to accomplish, both from an ecological standpoint as well as a socioeconomic standpoint. And when I had the privilege of becoming faculty in the school at the University of Maine in the School of Marine Sciences, we were able to bring that network in-house as part of my research group. Okay, so now this work has been evolving, and now we have this question and this hypothesis. During periods of system shock, we can expect to see seafood systems localizing. And I felt like I needed to provide that context, this sort of detour into this work with communities to say, building off of those relationships that we've had with communities and that we've been building with communities, we're able to test this hypothesis. And the way that we did this starts like this. The Local Catch Network uses Google Analytics to track web traffic. This is what our web traffic looked like on a daily basis from January 2019 to January 2020, just before the pandemic happened. If that's hard to see and that feels like a flat line, that's because it's in relative contrast to what happened. In March of 2020, we start seeing social protections go into place, COVID-19 lockdowns, and you see this major spike suddenly of web traffic. Suddenly everyone is interested in finding local seafood. An important point here I should say is the Local Catch Network has a seafood finder that helps consumers locate community-based initiatives. They're doing local and direct seafood marketing. And so suddenly you see this massive spike that we've never experienced, clearly not since June 2019, but in our history since 2011, never close to that. And we started asking this question, what is happening here? And so we reached out to our Local Catch Network, and we reached out to the network and said, would you be willing to share your Google Analytics from your own business website on a daily basis? Now, for those of you who work with natural resource users in any context, the thought of reaching out cold to somebody that you haven't worked with in the past to say, do you mind sharing proprietary daily information with me? At best, you might get no answer. At worst, it's probably a pretty impolite response, right? That this is business information. Why would that information be shared? So because of these relationships we've been developing over the years, we're able to reach back out to this network to say, we don't want to understand what is happening in the local and regional seafood space during this pandemic. And will you share this daily information with us? So we were able to collect this information from all these different direct marketing arrangements across North America. And the results are really, really interesting. So this is data it's a box and whisker plot from January ultimately through June of 2019 and 2020. The white boxes represent 2019. The blue boxes represent 2020. And so in January of both years, we don't see any statistical difference. They're about at the same level. Same in February. Then something starts happening in March. And you can see the box gets spread out. And part of this is that these social protections happened in the middle of March. If you would split this, you would have seen that more clearly. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge difference between what we see in 2020 and what we see in 2019. And so this is this pandemic bump where suddenly there's this big influx of consumption of local and regional seafood. And so we see this in the Local Catch website. We also see this from data from across our network. It's also interesting that if you use Google Trend data, so this is like, what are people searching for? This is data from 2015 to 2020, June of 2020, for all kinds of different terms. So local food, you see that same spike. Community supported agriculture, you see a similar spike. Seafood delivery, same spike. Where you don't see it is some term like seafood. There's a seasonal trend to it, but you don't see that spike. So there's this really big push into the local and regional food space, including seafood. We also did a series of interviews with members, qualitative interviews, 60 of those, roughly 60 interviews to sort of provide context for this spike that we see. And people reporting this as sort of this unprecedented time for local and regional seafood. So this has made us start putting together this model for what is going on during periods of crisis in the food system, but in particular in the seafood system. And so here we have this figure. There's a couple different parts to it. This is export data for seafood out of the US and Canada. And you can see by and large, we're exporting more seafood. That's consistent with the global trend, except there are these moments in time where you see it dip. These happen to be consistent with global recessions. And when you have these types of shocks, when you have kind of disruptions that happen, basically different parts of the supply chain get essentially stuck. So harvesters can't go out fishing, or processors can't do processing. Distributors have a hard time moving product to consumers. And so we're working on putting together this model that says, essentially, if you imagine this as a plane of the distribution for seafood, during sort of quote unquote normal times, seafood is harvested local, and it leaves that system, creating a local void. So you're losing product from the local system, and it's going out into the global system. And then sort of like this. And then during moments of shock, when the supply chain is disrupted, is stuck, product isn't able to get out into the system, pressure builds up, and these local and regional markets become an important pressure valve in the system, critical to getting the system unstuck, working again, but also represents an important outlet for seafood product during these moments of crisis. And so there's often discussion about sort of the global versus local, or local versus global. This work, from my perspective, suggests that there's actually an important interconnectivity between the local seafood systems and the global distribution systems, and suggesting that it's not an either or better or worse, but suggesting that there's this important coupling that is happening. And in order to have resilient seafood systems, it's important to have both global infrastructure as well as the local and regional infrastructure. So that brings us back to thinking about where are we today and the work that the Local Catch Network is doing to build resilience and strengthen local and regional seafood systems. So for us, there's this opportunity, and the opportunity is to address the vulnerabilities in our seafood system, right? I started this talk by talking about this fishiness of our food system, and I would maintain that a system that is heavily over-reliant on a global distribution is vulnerable to shocks and disruptions. And we have a history of that And certainly as the system becomes more and more globalized, we'll be increasingly prone to these shocks. So the opportunity at hand is to figure out how do we address these food system, and in particular the seafood system vulnerabilities that support social and ecological sustainability. And the way that we're doing this within our network, it can be bent into these four approaches. The first is around storytelling, helping to tell the story of local seafood, of community building that is happening around local and regional seafood systems. The second is around developing and supporting technical assistance to catalyze these operations, to make them robust, to make them sustainable, to help them grow. The third is through peer-to-peer learning and exchange. The fourth is through research and analysis to help us understand these systems, all with the desired outcome of building robust local and regional seafood systems that support healthy and vibrant coastal communities. So very quickly, on the storytelling front, since the beginning of the pandemic, in partnership with the University of Guelph, we launched a podcasting series called Social Fish Distancing. And this is a podcast series with many of the local catch network members, revisiting them on a every few week basis to understand and enable them to tell their story. So they've had this opportunity, fishermen and seafood producers who are doing direct and local seafood have had this opportunity through the entire extent of the pandemic to share their story, to share their experience. In addition to that, we're launching this new initiative, a national magazine to help tell the narrative of small-scale community-based fisheries and the role they play in food systems and community development. We've also been deeply engaged in developing resources and technical assistance. From a resource perspective, over the years, we've developed a set of manuals and how-tos. We currently have an initiative underway with the National Sea Grant Law Center to do an assessment of local and direct marketing rules and regulations across the country, with the goal of developing a model regulation that could be potentially adopted by coastal communities around the US to help facilitate and strengthen direct seafood marketing. We've also done a whole range of technical assistance. This is an image from South Australia several years ago where their government sent us out to meet with coastal communities. We've done one-on-one and community-based technical assistance. Starting this summer and for the next 3 years with funding support from the US Department of Agriculture, we're launching a new accelerator program that will be cohort-based, in particular working with BIPOC communities that are engaged in local and direct seafood marketing. We've also focused extensively on peer-to-peer networking and exchange. Over the years, we've hosted these summits to bring people together to do co-learning and to share lessons learned. Often we hear from communities saying, wow, we're doing this innovative work and we feel like we're doing it by ourselves. To help people connect to other people who are doing this work is empowering. It helps accelerate the successes and sidestep the challenges they're having. And so we've been doing that work over the years. As part of this as well, we've been helping to facilitate fishermen who are engaged in this type of work participate in meetings and exchanges. Some of this work has been disrupted because of the pandemic, but the last of these events that we did, we brought a delegation to Rome to participate in a global summit on the sustainability of fisheries. This meeting had over 800 people. Our delegation represented half of the commercial fishermen that participated in that meeting. As well as doing that work, we have funding from the EU to help build out a sister network doing similar work in the EU. This work has also been a little bit delayed because of COVID, but we'll be doing this for the next couple of years. In addition to the network building, the peer-to-peer learning, we've also been engaged in research and analysis to better understand the role that these direct marketing arrangements play in facilitating coastal community resilience. As part of this, we've been working with the US Department of Agriculture. We're one of 16 food networks currently thinking about the impact that that COVID has had on local food systems. We have a graduate student, Paloma Henrique, who's now working on doing some pilot work to develop a participatory guarantee system. This is for these type of arrangements. It's essentially a self and peer-to-peer assessment program to help them on issues of sustainability, both social and economic sustainability. We're engaged in a global study funded by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations called Illuminating Hidden Harvests, that's analyzing, doing an assessment of small-scale fisheries. As part of that, we see small-scale fisheries as being this key link to local and regional food systems. And finally, while the US Department of Agriculture studies local and regional food systems, they don't include seafood as part of that equation. We recently received money from the National Marine Fisheries Service in partnership with USDA to do a pilot of a national study to understand the socioeconomic contribution of this type of seafood marketing arrangement. With greater investment and understanding of these systems, we think there can be more investment and sort of greater legitimacy of this work as central to local and regional food systems. So I'll end here by saying there's something fishy about our food systems. And that is that at the end of the day, local seafood is often not considered as an important part of our food systems. And the work that we're trying to do is to uplift that, to integrate them more fully into the work, into food systems work in general. So I'll stop there. Many people to thank for this work, and happy to field questions.
Can we give Josh a hand? He won't be able to hear us, but he might be able to see it if we put our hands up. And Josh, this was, I think you began at the start saying, although you were the last talk, and people sometimes say the last is best, that won't be the case. I think it was the case. This was a terrific talk, and it comes upon other terrific talks, but it raised so many questions for all of us, and so much that I just know we want to find a time to follow you, to spend more time with you, because we couldn't take it all in. There's so much that's rich and important that you're doing. Before I take on, introduce a few questions, I just want to mention to everybody that yesterday I happened to be in downtown Orono in the local store there, and the owner said, "Sign up here. We have something really exciting going on. Sign up here. There's this person, Joshua Stoll, who brings oysters, and our people can be a part of buying those oysters." So Josh, I'm saying all this, he doesn't just say these things, he's very involved in doing all these things. And I said to her, "Do you know he's giving a talk tomorrow at the Mitchell Center?" And she said, "Oh yes, I do. I hope to be able to listen." So Josh, one of the things that is so intriguing about all the different things that you said is the way you weave in so many perspectives and so many disciplines. You talked, for example, about things that have to do with community, about economics, about history, about sociology, about anthropology, about ecology, computer science, international policy. If faculty or students or colleagues or other people interested in those topics wanted to learn more about how you've learned to weave all those things together, what might you say to them?
That's a good and hard question. I think you know this, and I think this is probably true for many of the people who are affiliated with the Mitchell Center. for me, the work is very much driven by an interest to contribute to solutions rather than an interest in starting from a discipline and saying, well, this is the lane that I sit in and I won't get out of it. You know, I like to talk about how it relates back to fishing. There are people who only will use a fly to fish. There are people who use bobbers. There are people who use bait. From my perspective, if you need to use all of those, even simultaneously to catch that fish, it's good to mix and match.
Very, very interesting. Resilience was a central theme, and the shocks to the system. How have you come across that as an important theme? And if we wanted to learn more about the work that you're doing that really has to do with resilience, but maybe we didn't want to think about it in terms of fisheries. We wanted to think about it in terms of all the farmers, for example, in Maine. Would you have any suggestions for us? It's okay if you don't. I know it's.
Yeah, I mean, the piece that caught me is about farmers in Maine. Where I was going to go with the question at first is around this idea of resilience, and I think it's been compelling to many different people and many different disciplines. And I think about places like the Stockholm Resilience Center and the many different applications that resilience has played both in the social and ecological systems. When it comes to farm systems, I'm probably not the right person to answer that question. But I will say, and this has been really interesting to me over the last years, as I mentioned, this work that we're doing with USDA and these 15 other food networks. We've had these monthly calls with a wide range of networks, but most of them are in the agricultural space. There's some the terrestrial ag space, and the same issues of vulnerabilities in the food system and vulnerabilities in the system apply. They're the same ones that we're seeing in the seafood system also apply in the ag sector. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of interconnectivity between the two.
Very, very interesting. One question that was asked was, you mentioned stories and storytelling, and that is one of the themes in terms of the networking. And one of the questions asked us, what kinds of stories have helped communities, say, thinking about globalization or other kinds of issues?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. So during the pandemic, and this is true of this podcast, my sense is that people have just appreciated the opportunity to have their own voice. So I think there's a lot of people speaking for a lot of other people, and this podcast series is focused on community-based fishermen sharing their own perspective. And so I think there's something valuable about having your own voice in this context. I will add one other piece on the storytelling, and that is we were able to raise some money for a public relations for support from a public relations firm. And at first the plan was to use it to help promote the network itself. And that seemed like a great idea. And then we started getting into it and we said, well, why are we using these resources to point our finger at the network? Could we use these resources we have to help community-based fishermen connect and tell their own stories? And so there's been this kind of interesting pivot around telling their stories. And so we're using these resources. We're helping communities that often don't have a voice tell their own voice. And again, to me, that's a really important theme. I'll add one more piece to this question. There has been a lot of media attention recently about a documentary film called Seaspiracy. I haven't seen it, so it's hard for me to comment on it. But it has many people in the fishing industry very upset. And part of it is that, part of the critique is that the conclusion is don't eat seafood. And for many of these communities that are doing this deep community work and using seafood as that tool, that is a pretty devastating message. And I think it's critical to have counter narratives that help tell a different story about the important sustainability work communities are doing and around seafood, and to say, look, there's more nuance to this story. So, you know, when it comes to this question of like storytelling and globalization, well, part of it is like also telling a community-based narrative about what is happening and helping communities tell their own stories.
Again, very, very interesting in terms of thinking about how the stories get out, how to think about access that comes from TV shows now and YouTube and things, and what would that look like. This may sound like a out of left field question, but in terms of thinking about the children of Maine and their future, what stories do they need to hear? Do there need to be children's books? Do there need to be things that help them sort of understand at some level the importance, but also the complexity? And have you seen anything going on in that area?
Yes, well, as a father of a 4-year-old, I think a lot about children's books these days. I I do think there is a need for that, and this may not be exactly answering your question, but living in rural Maine, I have thought a lot about the stigma about living in rural places, and this you know, going back to David's point originally about this sort of brain drain. Like, there is a really sort of sad element to this, in my view, about like people leaving rural places and doing rural livelihoods, and that includes fishing, but other things as well. And you know, I don't know if storytelling is part of that, but it probably is. And you know, I think it's a lot of things. There's some structural, there's big structural issues. There's a whole suite of things, but to tell the stories of what it means and the value of rural living and rural livelihoods, I think is really important.
Thank you. You helped us think about so many different things, thinking about resilience, thinking about shocks to the system, thinking about globalization, thinking about systems approaches, thinking about communication, thinking about local level kinds of activities. And you wove those all together in a way that can help us think about next steps and what's really important in this area. And we're sad that our time with you today is over, because there's so much that we can walk away thinking about and hopefully share with others what we learned, and hopefully have a chance to work with you in the future and bring our particular skills to learning about your broad sense of the context. And so again, we want to thank you so much, and good luck with all your work, and we're sure glad you came back to Maine.
Thank you so much, Linda. I appreciate
Thanks.
it.